Okay, welcome also from my side to today's Zukunftskolleg Jour fixe. I'm honored to be chairing this session. My name is Thomas Müller, and together with Caroline Antus, whom I saw on the virtually present persons list, also from the Department of Philosophy, I am one of the scientific contacts of Babu Thaliath. Babu is professor of philosophy and German studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, or JNU for short, in New Delhi, India. And let me introduce him very briefly. We have known each other for a very long time, over 20 years, back in the days when we both started for our PhDs in Freiburg in Germany. Babu, who hails from Kerala in South India, came there to work under the supervision of Professor Klaus Jacobi, having finished an MA degree at JNU before. He was then already fully immersed in German literature, German philosophy, and the history and philosophy of science. As an aside, you may know of the stereotype that the really academically able Indians all study to become engineers before we go to somewhere else. So Babu is no exception, he's also a civil engineer. After completing his PhD, Babu has held positions in Bangalore and now at JNU, and he has held visiting positions at many distinguished universities in Europe, including the Humboldt University in Berlin, and also the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at Cambridge. He has published widely, and to not take too much of your time, let me just mention the newer monographs, all of which came out with distinguished German presses in the recent years. Natur und Struktur der Kräfte from 2010, Wissenschaft und Kontext in der frühen Neuzeit, Freiburg 2016, Die Verkörperung der Sinnlichkeit, also Freiburg 2017, and the newest work Vom Aufspüren der Axiome, die epistemisch-strukturelle Intuition und das moderne Wissenssystem, Freiburg, published this year, 2021. It is from the context of the latter work that today's talk is derived. Much looking forward, and my pleasure to hand over to you, Babu. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Thomas, for this introduction. As you have rightly mentioned, my today's talk is actually based on my recent publication. This is from Aufspüren der Axiome. So I borrowed it from the library, as normally I'm the only one who borrows these books from libraries. Even that was the case even before. So it's something quite unique. Anyway, so my talk today is based on the concept of structural intuition as introduced and was developed by Professor Martin Kemp, renowned art historian, Professor Emeritus in Oxford, in around 25 short essays, in fact invited articles, published in the science magazine Nature, very prestigious journal, between 1997 and 2000. And then later these essays were collected and edited in a book published from Nature, which is Visualization, the Nature Book of Art and Science by Martin Kemp. In fact, this is quite popular, and there is a German translation of that published, Bilderwissen, which is there in the library. And unfortunately, I don't have that English one with me, it's at home. So these are very short essays and explaining or explicating the concept of structural intuition in art and science. What Kemp actually tried is to explain the shared intuition, something that is shared between artist and scientist in understanding the phenomenal structures. And thereby, as a principle, there is an infallible resonance between intuitive structures, internal intuitive structures, and external phenomenal structures. That's something that both artists and scientists share, but it is not confined to art and science. In fact, in this book, in the introduction to the book, which I will read out soon, there are references to very ordinary, very day-to-day situations or events like sport. So I'm particularly interested in that, and I've worked on that. So, so in this introduction, it's a very short introduction, only a few pages, but I found it very useful. He explains the principle of the structural intuition, as I just mentioned, as a resonance between internal intuitive structures from the subject and the givenness, the given structures of in the phenomenal world, the phenomenal structures. In fact, there was a very seminal lecture delivered by Martin Kemp in 2002. It's Felix Buddha lectures. It's organized by Hubert Buddha Foundation at the Ludwig Maximilian University. It was in 2002 December, and I was so fortunate I was there. A wonderful lecture. So I have listed that in the bibliography of the literature. And after that there was a workshop, and in that workshop, Kemp explained or announced that these structural intuitions, which mostly refer to static structures, but also to dynamic structures. And I was more interested in the dynamic structures, and since then I've been working on that in various articles or short monographs. I met Kemp in 2000 in Oxford, and I was supposed to do my postdoc in Oxford, but I didn't get a fellowship. And finally, I ended up in the other university, Cambridge, but still I maintain my contact, and I've been working on this concept over a period of 20 years, and published a couple of works. Anyway, so I'll just read out this, the very first paragraph from Kemp's introduction. So looking across the wide range of images in this book, the immediate impression is diversity. But underneath the varied surface runs some constant currents in our human quest for visual understanding. The most enduring of these currents is our propensity to articulate acts of seeing through what I am calling structural intuition. There is always a danger in offering a compact phrase as a summary of a complex concept, but its deliberately double reading retains an openness that works against its becoming too formulaic. It is double in the sense that the structures are both those of inner intuitive processes themselves and those of external features whose structures are being intuited. I believe, as will already be apparent, that the deep structures of intuition with which we have been endowed by nature and nurture stand in a non-arbitrary relationship to definable elements in the structure and behavior of the physical world. So, and after that, almost 10 years of research done by Kemp, and the results were again summarized in Page Barber lectures that he delivered in 2012 at the University of Virginia, and was published from the University of Virginia Press in a beautiful monograph with the title Structural Intuitions of Seeing Shapes in Art and Science. I will recommend this work because this focuses only on the concept of structural intuition. Yeah, and before I explain the structural intuition with various examples given by Kemp in these two works, I just want to briefly introduce what I do with this concept of Martin Kemp. So, as I mentioned in my abstract, I'm trying to establish structural intuition as an axiomatic intuition, as the primary mode of axiomatic intuition, particularly in the early modern mathematical sciences, and that is classical mechanics and also optics. And so in that attempt, of course, I focus more on the science and not on the art, but I'll explain this concept with mostly the examples from the art. So there are, I would say, what are axiomatic intuitions? Or the question is, what are axioms? The axioms are interestingly not explanations. It doesn't explain anything. So there is no causal structure in an axiom. Axioms are descriptions of physical phenomena. So, for example, I'm referring to the early modern mathematical sciences, the principle of inertia or the universal gravitation or the parallelogram law and many other axioms. So it doesn't say why it is like that. So if it says that, then that implies there is a deeper causal structure, and because of that it cannot become the first principle. So this is the spirit of the early modern philosophy, Descartes, Newton, Hooke, Kepler, Galileo, searching for the first principle. And that search is, I would say, it's a search for finalities. It is the finality of the knowability from the part of the subject, and equally from the part of the phenomena. It is an ontological finality, the finality of the givenness of these most elementary mechanical structures. So the axioms emerge out of a synthesis of both, of various finalities. So there is a internal, intuitive, epistemic access to the phenomenal structures, and from the phenomenal structures, how they are given in certain final structural forms. And obviously, when you think of the mathematical formalism that was deployed in the early modern mathematical sciences to axiomatize the principles, and geometry or mathematics which naturally creates these final forms. So, and that's how it is like, for example, the law of inertia. So it has a long prehistory in the medieval scholastic philosophy naturalis. What actually causes the free motion, and which is the inertial motion, free, the linear and uniform motion. So the scholastic philosophers were speculating about an impetus that is being transferred from the mover to the free moving body, and there are various arguments whether it is an accompanying causation or an intrinsic causation. So you'll find a number of medieval natural philosophers or philosophers working on this the causation. And as Pierre Duhem explains in his seminal work, and most of these elementary forms of mechanics remained an aporia, whether it is space or time, place, movement, infinitesimally small entity, or impetus or gravity. But interestingly, in the advent of early modern mechanical philosophy with Descartes and later Descartes, Newton, Galileo, and Kepler, suddenly these aporetics vanished. These aporias just vanished. And all these principles were mathematically axiomatized. So, axiomatic. So, these axioms describe these phenomenal structures, and my argument is in a structural intuition. So, it is always a composite intuition, first of all. Why? Because the counterpart, the phenomenal structures, are always a combination of scalars and vectors. Obviously, vectors, in case of an inertial motion, it is directional. But in the transition from the mathematical to material sciences, so like there's a wonderful treatise by Alan Chalmers, how the pressure became from a vector to a scalar. So it's always a combination of mathematical, mechanical, and mechanical material intuition. So it is a composite form. And because of the composite form of the phenomenal structures, the intuition has to be composite. So it is a composite form of mathematical, mechanical, and material. So this is roughly the background framework. And obviously in the axiomatic, in the early modern mechanical philosophy or the early modern mechanics, the first part is preferred, the mathematical and mechanical intuition, and unfortunately masking the second part, which is the mechanical and material intuition, because as I mentioned earlier, it is difficult to conceive or understand a finality of the epistemic axis in a scalar. But in a vector, it is easy because these are forms like line and uniform motion, and which are final forms. So you cannot imagine a line straighter than another line, or uniform motion or more uniform than another uniform motion. But when it comes to pressure, viscosity, surface tension, friction, shear, and many other scalars, it's as if my epistemic quest or epistemic axis ends nowhere. So if it doesn't end anywhere, it becomes again an acquired. So that's how the axiomatic effectively it could overcome the apolitics of the medieval scholasticism. So with that introduction, so I will just explain how Kemp established this concept of structural intuition. So this is, I mean, what I explained was the most difficult theoretical part, and this is going to be a bit lighter part. And this is typical of Kemp, taking examples from everywhere and from the art. And from the, most of these references are from the early modern science and art. So there are references from Descartes, Kepler, from Newton, and also from Albrecht Dürer, from Bruno Lecce, the discoverer of central perspective, and Pierre de la Francesca, values, the anatomy, and many others. And also there are many references from the modern art. This is one from the modern art, and Jonathan Cullen, a young British artist, and it's a dust landscape. So in fact, what you see is the sizes of a room, and it's a formation of dust resembling canyons and mountains. And what Kemp is interested in the process in which it was made, and how this was made. So what Jonathan Cullen did was, first he took a large metal sheet and made holes, not randomly, but not regular either. And the dust particle, the powder, plaster, or cement, stored above this plate and dropped through these holes, almost sieved through these holes. And the dropping of this dust particle obviously pile up, and as we all know, till a critical angle emerges, and after which there are avalanches, so that angle will remain constant, like this. So after the critical angle, the powder particles will trickle, and so if you reverse that form, you will find the canyon and the center point, and also the contours of this beautiful sculpture. You can say sculpture, and it's made of powdered plaster or cement, and solidified, and the final form emerges out of that. So interestingly, after this was published in Nature, after Kemp published that in Nature, so Adrian Webster from the Royal Conservatory of Edinburgh and published another article in Nature pointing to the fact that if you take a view from the top, this resembles, and it's a computer model of the nature, and these cells resemble Voronoi cells, and Voronoi named after Georgy Voronoi, the great Russian mathematician. These Voronoi cells are constellation of galaxies in the cosmos. So this simple sand formation, as deployed by Jonathan Cullen to create an artwork, finally there's an analogy between a cosmic model, which is the Voronoi cells, and Jonathan Cullen's work of art. And how this is formed, and what's the mathematical principle or mathematical mechanical principle behind this, it's quite simple. So if you consider a central point, a hole, and the domain or the field of its cell, that is the region where the sand particle fall into that hole and drops. It is, if you join this central hole with the other holes and then find a middle point and draw the perpendicular bisectors. So this will, for example, so this is the center and the perpendicular bisector, and this will be the shape of the surrounding contours and the canyon. So, and similarly, other canyons can also be plotted like this. So for Kemp, this is a perfect example of a structural intuition where Jonathan Helen may not be aware of this mathematical or mechanical principle, but he had an intuitive knowledge of what would be the result. So this is, I would say, a combination or a composite form of both scalar and vectors. So there is clearly the vectors of mechanical processes and the cohesion or the fineness of the granular particles and such scalar properties. And finally, how Kemp would say, describes this as a self-organized criticality of nature, of a natural formation. And this could be seen in a rainforest, for example. So another example is his quite famous, this is Arthur Worthington's Phases of a Splash. And Kemp, after 2002, worked extensively on hydrostatic. And hydrostatic is a very interesting area, a very interesting object of research, because hydrostatic famously included the scalars. I mean, for example, the pressure. It was the advent of hydrostatic that the earlier the dominance of vectors gradually changed, and then more and more scalar properties were studied. So when I say the structure of vector and the structure of scalar, there is a difference. A structure of a vector is quite clear, but the structural intuition of a scalar, like how to intuitively feel the pressure and feel the viscosity or feel the elasticity, it's a challenge. But still I would call it a structure in a certain sense, and would differentiate it from the vectors. So this is in a fluid milk, small spherical objects, metal objects may be dropped, and what is seen here is the splash at different stages. So what they did, they used very high-speed camera, so which can take 1/100th, which is the shutter speed the minimum shutter speed is 1/100th of a second. And also this dynamic process is stilled using a spark lasting less than 3 millionths of a second. I don't know how that can be achieved, 3 millionths of a second. So this is beyond my imagination. Anyway, the result is a fantastic structure of a splash at different stages. And what they did, they used different, same size spheres and with the same mass, weight, but with different surfaces, smooth and rough surfaces. And also with different fluid, water, milk, or oil. There were slight variations of these splashes. So then you see that it's a combination of the vectors and but dominated by the scalars of the scalar entities like the density or viscosity or surface tension of the fluid and the smoothness of the surface of the object that's falling on this, etc. So yeah, and this is something which was not introduced in the essays he published, but in the introduction. And as I read this some 15 years back, I was so excited because this was for me something so useful, as I mentioned before. This is about sport. And Kemp, in this introduction, gives the examples of football, and it's very common here. And the football match between Italians and the English. Yeah, and two different teams of completely different nature. And I'll read it out. And what he was trying to prove that there are differences, but despite these differences, there are more commonalities that these players share, whether they are English or British or German or French or Indian, whatever, all over the world. So he's more interested in the shared structural intuition, despite there are differences. So it is my conviction that the shared elements exceed the divergent ones, though it is inevitably the differences that most strike us, particularly as historians of culture. We may, for example, be very conscious of deep-seated differences in the way that the Italians and the English have played football over the years. The former is full of flair and sometimes exaggerated style, and the latter characterized by athletic vigor and stoic belligerence. These are all a bit cliches, but then it's true also. I mean, we must admit. And we can point to the fact that the rules are decreed by a cultural organization, FIFA. But it is actually far more extraordinary that any able-bodied and sighted person from diverse cultures can really judge the speed of and position of approaching ball and kick it back with interest. The increasing apparent size of the football as it speeds towards us and its relationship with the foreground and background objects all tell us something real. The laws that govern the inertia of the ball and the coefficient of its elasticity may be unknown to most professional footballers, but they have instinctively acquired a precise sense of how fast it is arriving and what force is needed to propel it back in the right direction at the desired speed. The structures of the external world within which we need to operate are those with which the internal structure of intuition has been designed to resonate, continuously reinforcing and retuning themselves in a ceaseless dialogue of matching and making. So, I mean, this is obviously a kicking to the goal post. But then there are so many passes where you see the ball doesn't go straight, it is curved, and how it is kicked, and it's hardly kicked directly. It's always kicked on the side, and I would say in a spontaneous way, you have to really feel the elasticity of the ball and the surface friction and the vectors like how this can be spinned and takes a curvature and all. So a very talented player, Ronaldo or Schweinsteiger, from a 30-meter kick, how he can place the ball exactly at one top corner of the goal post. And the only causation is the touch of that foot on the ball. And then it's a free motion. So anyway, this is a very interesting example. I worked on it, and obviously, based on my interest, I tried to extend this on two different games. The one is cricket, and the other is tennis. And why I chose these two, because the cricket, in cricket as compared to football, the vectors dominate. Because we have a cork ball, it's very hard, yeah, and a bat, it's slightly elastic, but it's still a hard bat. And the pitch also, and the ball moves very fast. So because of that, the participation of scalars are reduced. Of course there is, like when you talk about the outfield, how fast it is, or the various strokes and the flight of the ball and all. But then interestingly, so this I'm finding very interesting. As you know, the cricket, people play cricket, and those who watch cricket should describe it. That's also a part of the play. You should know what it is. And so there is bowling and batting, and so different types of bowling. And first the fast bowling, the pace and medium pace, and mostly it is a swing bowling. So what they do is the bowler and all the players in the field, when they get the ball, they rub one hemispherical side of the ball, the trouser, or they apply saliva, and to make it smooth. And the other side, they make it rough. So there is a difference between a smooth and rough surface in the air resistance, and because of that, when you throw the ball very fast, in the fast bowling, it swings. So it swings inward to an in-swinger, it can be an out-swinger, and there are reverse swing, and where the in-swinger becomes out-swinger. I don't know how that happens. So that is swing bowling, and it's even more clear in the spin bowling. So where the ball is deliberately turned while bowling. So there is an off spin and leg spin, and a more complicated googly. And it's not that it's lower, and when it rebounds at the batting pitch, it deviates from the straight path. And if it is from left to right, it's off spin, and right to left, it is leg spin. And googly is, I think the ball spins in 2 directions. So that's how this bowling is specified. And when it comes to batting, the different strokes in batting, it's so interesting. And there is straight drive, cover drive, on drive, square drive, forward even sweep, and hook, short, late cut. And in the picture, this is so great Sachin Tendulkar playing a late cut. It's a very risky shot, the late cut. Yeah, and of course he can do that without any problem. And because late cuts is always the ball comes and it's somehow using the pace of the ball and the people and the gully, the fielders who are fielding there. And because it is so fast, they miss the ball. But it is too risky because if the ball rises, there will be a catch, so they will be out. So, and this is exactly how it is studied. So the ball can bounce, and if it's a bouncer, it's a very short pitch ball and rises up to the head, then the batsman has to play a hook shot. And if it's a Yorker, which is deadly, and he has to play a beautiful straight drive. And a medium pitched ball, there will be that either he will play a sweep shot or a square cut or a pull, whatever. So I mean, all these descriptions are, to my mind, structural intuitions indirectly, and we are not aware of that. But then we are describing the movement or describing the structure of the movement of the ball as it is bowled and batted in certain ways, in certain possible ways. And these are all done in a very fast manner, and it's not that like somebody like Bradley bowling to Sachin Tendulkar, and Tendulkar has no time to think. In fact, he's not thinking, oh, let me play a square cut. No, his language is his action. So it is like that. So here I see a very interesting composite structural intuition, and mostly consists of vectors. And then in tennis it is even more interesting because the ball is softer and there is air inside, there is air pressure, and the tennis racket has a net, and it is, the tension is very important, so there is elasticity, and also the specification of the court. I mean, the grass court is smoother, clay court is more rough, and then there is hard court. So when you play, you have to somehow take into consideration all these vectoral and scalar entities, and except for the volleys in a long rally, the forehand or the backhand, the ball is not hit directly, it is always sliced. So it's a tangential touch of the ball, and very talented players, maybe from Christopher Lloyd to Sharapova, or from Boris Becker to Federer, they know exactly, just by this slicing the ball, to place the ball at the corner of the other court. And also, just like the spin bowling, so there is a spin when it rebounds. How is it possible? How is it possible? And Kemp would say, or Kemp has always said in this lecture, we try to get into the material, or try to get into the phenomenal structures. So that is exactly my premise. And to get into the phenomenal structure, for me, is an epistemic access. So, these are the various shorts, and now I move into the second part, what I do with this structural intuition. So I would argue in a structural intuition, which is a form of synthesis of internal intuitive structures and the phenomenal structures, from the side of the subject, or the player, or the artist, or the scientist, there is an epistemic attempt, or an epistemic access, Zugang in German, access to the phenomenal structures. and from the phenomenal structures, the givenness of the structures. And all these have to be final. So, I mean, if I say the epistemic axis is final, it should end in the structure. And if I say the phenomenal structure is final, it should have a final form, and mostly a geometrical form in the early modern mechanics. The problem is, in case of scalars, how do we understand the structure of a scalar? I mean, the structure of pressure, the structure of elasticity, the structure of speed or retardation, and all these things. So, in this combination, just like an axiom which is a finally justified, let's be grounded, you say. So there is no causal structure, deeper structure in an axiom. So this is described in final forms and final intuitions. So, but what happens in the axiomatization, as I mentioned earlier, most in case of the scalar entities, this epistemic axis cannot end. It ends nowhere. So if it ends nowhere, it creates an aporia. It's a kind of, you don't know where to move, in fact. So many of the mechanical phenomena is a combination of vector and scalars. Yeah. But what happens in the axiomatic, in the axiomatization, they conveniently focus on the mathematical mechanical intuition and suppress the mechanical material intuition. This happened in the law of inertia, in gravity, and in many other laws. But first, let me introduce one of the most simple, actually simple vector law of parallelism. So a body is at O and is being acted by two different forces, OP and OQ, vectoral forces, and the resultant should be an OR. It's very simple. So, and this is a fantastic correlation between geometry and mechanics. Yeah? And these are bodies are not considered to be material in the sense that this can be considered to be point masses, like Newton did in the astronomy. The planets were considered to be point masses. And this is another example, a very interesting example, in the 1679 correspondence between Robert Hooke and Newton. So this is actually the beginning of Principia by Newton. The Hooke sent a letter on asking a question. If a body is dropped from the height from the earth, and it's hypothetical, that if it moves without any resistance to the center of the earth, what would be the path or the trajectory? And Newton answered, because of the gravitational force, so it will take a slight curve and then end up at the center, which is C. And then Hooke argued against that, because we have to consider other factors, because the rotation of the Earth and other scalar, like the acceleration, the speed of the, I mean, it should speed up when near the center. And for Hooke, it will form a spiral, and A, F, K, H, and then finally end up in C. And Newton agreed to that, but still corrected that into a more scientific, it's an oscillation, an elliptical oscillation of this orbits, and finally to end up. And this is just an example I want to give the correspondence between Hooke and Newton. So this is for me a fantastic and the most ingenious structural intuition in Principia, how Newton axiomatized the area law of Johannes Kepler. So there are various treatises on that by Leonard Cohen, Westphal, and many of these historians of science in the 20th century. For Newton, Kepler discovered this area law out of guess. He just guessed. So Kepler was, I mean, he didn't want to just give up this belief that the orbits were perfectly circular and the orbital motion is uniform. But based on the empirical data given to him by Tycho Brahe, and he had to finally give up that. But then the idea of ellipse was a guess for, according to Newton. But interestingly, in this proof, which is a great synthesis between geometrical rules, geometrical forms, principles, and mechanical forces. So there is linear inertial motion, and a centripetal gravitation which varies according to the inverse square law, and then the mathematical operation of infinitesimal calculus, differential integral calculus. So using these three principles, Newton could prove that the movement of a planet, the inertial movement of a planet, if that is reflected by a gravitational force, it will take the form of a curve. But the problem is, this is an example I took from Bernard Cohen. Newton was obviously or famously inclined to mathematical formalism. So he always took the form first. I mean, that finality of the form, and then proved the reverse. So first he took an elliptical orbit and proved the gravitational force as varying inversely to the square of the distance, which is the inverse square law. But the problem is the reverse case. The premises are mostly mechanical. So there is a gravitational force varying according to the inverse square law, and the inertia, the speed of the planet, it will not give a final answer. That's the problem. Yeah. It can be various forms of ellipses, parabolas, hyperbolas, or even a straight line. That means there is no finality of a form. So it is of course, the area law is an axiom, but the law of elliptical orbit, I would say, is less axiomatic than the earlier axiom of perfectly circular and uniform motion of the planets. So, and this is a kind of, infinite forms can it take. And this was actually a problem of Newton. Interestingly, as is well known in the history, the first model he took was not even mechanical, it was purely geometrical. Of course, the base is divided equally into various parts, in a way representing the inertial motion of a body. But, But still, sorry about that. But still, then he divided the base into various equal parts, and then he takes a point, external point, and without any gravitational force on that point. And obviously, if you connect the lines, these triangles have equal areas because of the same base and the height. So the first model was a geometrical model, a perfect final geometrical model. And then Newton said, if a gravitational force is introduced at the point O, obviously the path will curve, still maintaining the area law. So my question is, isn't it a guess? It is a guess. Of course, he proved it later. Yeah, the same Newton who accuses Kepler, discovering elliptical law as a guess, or the area law of Hooke a guess, and he himself, and following this, axiomatization, the formalism, the mathematical formalism, actually guessed. And the problem is, there is a very interesting anecdote. Edmund Halley visited Newton at Cambridge in 1684, and asked a question, gave two premises which are mechanical. The one is the gravitational force and varying according to the inverse square law, and the inertial motion is linear motion of a planet. What would be the outcome? What would be the shape of the orbit? So Newton immediately said it would be an ellipse, and Halley was surprised. And how is it possible? How did you find it out? And Newton was saying, of course, I calculated. And then Halley asked for the proof, and Newton said, okay, I will send it to you. But he didn't send it immediately. It took 3 or 4 months or more than that. And finally, what Halley got is the reverse proof. What Halley was asking, or what Halley asked, is if given to mechanical premises, what would be the shape of the orbit? And what Newton proved, given the shape of the orbit, and the gravitation will vary according to the inverse square law. So you cannot, there is no reciprocity in these two. So if the mechanical premises are given, it's a much more difficult operation to find out the final form, because there is no final form. And later, the Johannes Bernoulli proved that, or maybe discovered that, it can be any conic sections. So you will find that these are the flaws in the axiomatization of laws. And so what I tried is, how to, adding more initial conditions to this problem, and which could result into an elliptical orbit. And this I'm not going to explain because I don't have much time, but this is a very interesting structural intuition by Descartes explaining the phenomenon of reflection and diffraction. And in this model, this is purely mechanical, so three different surfaces, or more than that, a plane smooth surface and a convex surface, and the movement of the balls, of the rebounding, is exactly that is following the reflection of light. And it's a very simple model in geometry, but it's an amazing example of a structural intuition. And here, in this, he introduced the scalar. Using a tennis bat, the ball is hit on the surface of fluid, and then it deviates, like refraction of light. And depending upon the difference in the density between the air and the fluid can also be oil, and be water, and also the loss of weight in the fluid. It can lead to this. It may not be an exact analogy, but still it explains the phenomenon. And this I will skip. And these are my final slides. And it's between Newton and Hooke, and there's always the dispute who discovered the universal gravitation. And there's a beautiful treatise essay by Richard Westphal. And many argue that because Hooke, as the first president of the Royal Society, gave a number of lectures and clearly suggesting the actual distance. And Newton later axiomatized into universal gravitation. But Richard S. Westphal was pointing out, in fact, what Hooke did was a material mechanical intuition. He used the analogy of congruence and incongruence of fluida. So, for example, the water and oil won't mix each other, or the mercury stands on, it can sink in metal, but on wood, not on wood, etc. And he was actually investigating the capillary rise, and how the capillary rise happens. There is an incongruence between air and glass, and because of that incongruence, there is a reduction of pressure and the water rises. So he was equating incongruence with repulsion and congruence with attraction. So I'm not going into detail, but Westphal was arguing, because of this material intuition, Hooke could not reach beyond a particular gravity. So he was actually saying within the spheres of the celestial bodies, they attract all other bodies. But not that the sphere is infinite. But Newton postulates or axiomatized it into infinite extension of gravity. But now the question is, were there enough evidences for that other than the tidal phenomenon? Was that enough? So here you see the difference between a mathematical mechanical and a mechanical material intuition. Of course, from the inverse square law, you can actually prove that this diminution of the intensity of gravitation is infinite and it can extend infinitely. But that is purely a mathematical framework. But in the material framework, it's so difficult to imagine that a centripetal force, something which pulls to a center, can extend immediately. So at some point of time, as if the gravitational extension of the gravitational field is a repulsion and the force is an attraction, so the resultant has to be a limit. So the Kant observes this extension of the bodies as a force of repulsion. So this I just tried. Anyway, just to highlight this problem, and this is my final slide. This is a famous aporia, which is the Zenot's paradox. Still there are articles published on this, and so the point is like, see, there is Achilles and there's a schildkröte. This is from my German. This is tortoise. So tortoise starts from the middle of the track, and Achilles cannot overtake tortoise. So as it is described by Zenon, when A reaches B, S reaches C, when A reaches C, S reaches D, etc. So the infinite division of the space. The point is, this is an aporia only if it is a mathematical, mechanical intuition. And in a mechanical material intuition, you have to include the scalar, which is the speed. And you have to specify the speed, and that has to be a retardation, a form of retardation, infinite retardation. And interestingly, both Achilles and tortoise have the same retardation, but because they start from different points, both of them tend to the same limit infinitely, and in an infinitely reducing speed, and finally appear. You cannot differentiate at the limit, but there is an infinitely small distance between the limit and these runners. And obviously, the Achilles cannot overtake the tortoise. So the point is, this was a simple mechanical phenomenon presented as an aporia, a mathematical aporia. So, as I mentioned earlier, the 300 or 400 years of aporetics in the medieval scholastic Philosophia Naturalis, and there are various investigations on that after Anneliese Meyer and Pierre Duhem. How come these aporetics suddenly vanished and became axiomatized? So my argument that those discussions on aporia, incessant discourses on aporia, were mostly the material intuition, mechanical material intuition, like the impetus, for example, the inertial motion. And in the early modernity with Descartes, Newton, Galileo, and Kepler and others, deploying the mathematical formalism, one part of this structural intuition masked the other part, or I would say buried the other part. Because science has to be pragmatic. You cannot simply go on discussing these things incessantly. We have to stop somewhere and start. And these axioms as first principles, predominantly in a mathematical, mechanical framework, actually suppressed that long aporia which were material intuition. And I would say this just like a Friedhof, beautiful garden, but beneath an altar, you have the crypta of tombs and piled skulls and all. I'm not saying they are dead. On the contrary, they are live. The aporias are live, and it can resurrect, it always resurrects. So, interestingly, the axioms as first principles, finally justified, irreducible, has to be ahistoric. But in the reality, they are historic, whereas aporias can prove to be ahistoric. So that's what I'm doing here, and just a propedeutic to my research now in Konstanz. I'm so sorry about that. It took some time. Thank you so much.